Kia ora and welcome to the Impact Collective podcast. We're joined here today with Justin Lester, the Government Director of Loves Data. I thought I might start today, seeing as you've said that you haven't read your Wikipedia page, and tell you what they're telling you about yourself. So let's see how correct this is. So, raised in the heart of the South End in Invercargill.
Raised, yes, but in a wee quirk of nature. I was actually born in a place called Ward, and often we'll drive through with the kids and say, why is Ward famous? And my kids never figure it out either, but I was born there. Born in Blenheim, lived in Ward, and why that's interesting is because way back in 1978, there was supposed to be a ferry terminal move from Picton to Ward, and my family bought a business there, or my mum and dad. But it never happened. So don't ever believe anything politicians ever say, and certainly don't base your life decisions or business decisions around it, because it didn't happen.
There we go. Interesting coming from a political person. You are a New Zealand businessman and politician, or were. You were the Mayor of Wellington between 2016 and 2019, following 6 years on the Wellington City Council. You have an LLB and a BA in German from the University of Otago and a Master of Laws from the University of Heidelberg in Germany.
That's the one, yep.
Okay, we're going well. Before entering local politics, you worked in property and asset management and in commercial real estate.
I did.
For your sins, okay. You co-founded the salad bar chain Kapai in 2005.
Yes.
Following your role in the council, you took up positions as the Government Director of Loves Data and Savings Ambassador for Simplicity. All correct?
So far, so good.
Fantastic. And you and I met while we were working on the preliminary dashboards for the Impact Collective.
Yeah.
Very interesting collaboration in terms of bringing together the statistics from a huge variety of sources and putting it into a dashboard where we have that ability to bring back granular level data. So we're super excited to be able to sit down and have a chat to you today, in particular around that half of our journey, which is around that data and just the importance of it. I guess hot topic at the moment is the census, and unfortunately, yet again, we're in a stage where there's been less than ideal levels of participation. In a previous podcast episode, I sat down and I spoke to Gareth Hughes around just that importance of the engagement with the census information and being able to participate, but some of the reluctance there around people believing that it's going to be used against them. Coming from Dot's perspective, what are some of those hidden nuances around the data collections that you guys have found effectively in analysing and reporting against the central government data sets, and how that can then be influencing local decision-making processes?
First things first, look, stats.nz do a wonderful job. In terms of the data that comes out, it's incredibly robust. But there are sometimes gaps, and unfortunately for the last census, some of those gaps were in relation to Māori and to iwi specifically, and so there are things we need to improve. We've done things in a similar way for decades, I guess, but we need to take a much more considered approach in terms of how we engage with groups, say Māori, with the disability community, and other communities as well. The data's robust, it's really important. That engagement process needs to be correct. We can get a lot from the admin data these days. That means that in some respects, could you undertake a census without talking to people? Well, yes, you probably could. It wouldn't be as good, it wouldn't be as nuanced, and it's really important you have that human aspect, that people are giving their responses. There are also some risks around human responses, and that they're not always accurate. People sometimes have an optimism bias, or they'll tell you about how they want to live. Did you commute by bike or by walking or by car today? Yeah. Aspirational. Oh yeah, I wish I'd biked. I'll put that down. As opposed to what they actually did. So sometimes we see some discrepancies there between what people say they do and what they actually do. But Stats.nz does a really good job.
What are some of the the concerns around that not being as robust as it could be? What particular sways do you believe that would have, as coming from experience within local council? How would that potentially impact upon your decision-making process?
Well, census underpins decision making, specifically at a government level, but then also it flows down to local government as well. A good example, we look at the west coast of the South Island, and they've had rapidly increasing deprivation levels over the last 8 to 9 years. But if a census was only undertaken every 5 years, then you're funding at the wrong levels or incorrect levels. A lot of those funding decisions are based on deprivation needs, and if they change quickly, it means that you deserve more money. In the Buller example, looking at this could have changed in the last little while, but up until recently, health funding was being provided on the basis of 2013 analysis. But we're now in 2023 and a lot's changed. I think Buller, relatively speaking, had dropped something like between 23 and 27 rankings, and we have 67 territorial authorities in New Zealand. So they dropped quite significantly and now one of the more deprived communities within the country, but they weren't getting that level of funding. And that's what they deserve. They deserve more money, they deserve more input. Their community requires investment because otherwise you'll see disparities between them and other communities.
Do we think that part of the reason for some of the reluctance to participate, we've spoken about one, which is people believe that it's tracked data effectively, but do we think that the way that we're collecting this, which is effectively survey-based, could be part of the problem? If we're starting to look at digital deprivation and access to digital devices to be able to complete them online, through to literacy issues to completing them. I know that stats.nz does a really good job about sending people out after the fact to support those that might potentially need additional assistance there, but do we think that that's having a flow-on impact in our participation rates around this as well?
Look, no system's perfect. I think there's, again, stats.nz has done a good job in the way they sought to engage and the digital approach, but there'll always be gaps. For the elderly, for those with lower levels of literacy, or those with lower levels of access to technology. One consistent barrier is one of trust, trust of government. We saw that, for example, with the parliamentary protests last year and COVID and vaccinations and the impacts that had on a certain segment of society, but historical context as well. For Pacifica, for Māori, and look, I'm not best placed to speak on their behalf, but you had things like dawn raids in the 70s that lowered levels of trust for the Pacifica community. You had Māori that were impacted by government through decisions that have been made in the past that therefore don't have as strong a trust in the institution of government and therefore don't want to talk to government or don't want to give up information readily about their personal well-being or their whānau's well-being. So those are some barriers that will always need to be worked hard at in order to overcome.
When we went along and we're going through the first iterations of the Impact Collective dashboard with .love's data, one of the things that we found is in some areas, because initially we looked at the wider 17 Sustainable Development Goals, that there is a lack of data in some areas. Climate change, climate action was one of them, life below water was one of them, life on land was another one of them. Do we see that through the lack of information and the lack of data that's available out there, a real ability for us to work with central government in order to increase those reporting and that data that's coming through, and how do we go about that really in order to embed and affect that kind of change?
Yeah, we've got to be faster at embracing new ways of working and implementing processes to enable that. It's disappointing and frustrating that we haven't been able to keep pace with change in measurements that technology could allow, particularly around the environment. Swimmability of rivers, that's a good measure that we have as a country, but land use change isn't a great one. A whole lot of other things around flora and fauna. Either it's not measured, it's certainly not measured in a consistent way, in an ongoing fashion, which you need to understand trends. Climate change is another one. We only report our greenhouse gas inventory 17 to 24 months after the fact, and it's only done sporadically. So we need to get better at doing that. And it feels deeply ironic, given that as a tourism brand, we're all about pure NZ, that we're not monitoring our environment as well as we could.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the kickers to that for us when we were first going through this is the readily available large data sets in terms of at a national level. But actually, if we start looking towards local people being the influence makers and decision makers in their own futures for their communities, we need to be able to go along and readily provide that more granular level, local, district, even regional level would have been ideal when we were going through this process some of the times. Do we foresee especially when we're working with Crown agencies and local councils, more of a push from your guys' perspective here at DOT to get that more granular level data down to a local level to be able to embed those changes?
There's certainly a strong demand. We see that from every council. They want to know what's happening locally within their communities, but not just a council or across local government. Businesses want that, individuals want that, communities want that, organisations locally, they all want that. What we need is some national scale. The best way to do that is for government to provide that local level of analysis and data. Government does it really well at a national level because that's what they're focused on. They're focused on national wellbeing. They drop down to the regional level, but again, regional level is not sufficiently insightful, and averages across a region can mask points of concern or issue. Again, we need to have a greater level of analysis, and it can be done. It's just that the investment is required and the time needs to be taken to make sure that it is done and done well. For me, all action takes place at a local level. Governments can fund at a national level, but ultimately action takes place locally in those communities. So you can't adopt or implement interventions to make change if you don't understand what's happening. We saw that through the Impact Collective. The great thing about that project was that the admin data and the analysis we undertook really similarly reflected the qualitative analysis and the research and one-to-one engagement with people on the ground and gave you a really then consistent story at both ends. Currently that doesn't happen nationally and it needs to.
It's interesting because one of the points that you pick up on is the differences that can occur at a regional level. At the moment, we're engaging with the Ruapehu, and it can be quite polarising. The differences that you see when you go down from a regional level down to those local levels, and I mean, we're seeing vast differences between what we would see in Taumaranui versus Ohakuni, for example, versus Waiuru, for example, where you can have real areas of true deprivation through to quite wealthy, and the fluctuations and nuances of how that impacts not only the economy, but the education, the health and well-being of those individuals, access to the economic and financial benefits that come along with that. Obviously, there's a little bit that's going on with the RAL situation at the moment, but that in itself will be interesting to see how the region, that rohe in particular, tax and becomes more agile if the mountain isn't that single source of tourism and trade, to see how they then go along and leverage on the other areas that they have coming through and that more local focus of tourism as well. But when we start working at that regional level, obviously it's about getting the right data in and the right people around the table to understand the importance of having the community there as their central focal point. that data is 50% of that story for us in our journey, but also reflecting on your point earlier around making sure that it is reflective and that lived experience is reflected in that as well. We've gone about it slightly differently, obviously, with going out there and engaging on that one-on-one basis or across facilitated sessions to bring in the verbatim narrative. Do we think that that's enough in terms of what we would be trying to achieve in terms of community engagement if we were to move away from just the age-old standard of conducting surveys to try and assess community wellbeing?
Yeah, like as I mentioned before, I think it's always that two-pronged approach. You need to engage with people and understand through research and through interviews what they're thinking, and they'll also provide responses around the nuance of what the data is saying to understand both aspects. But it's really important, again, to balance that against what the data states, because people won't always say what they're actually doing, or they won't always get it right. The Kapai is a great example, and we've done a lot of work with them because we help them build out some livability dashboards and it's a perfect example of regional analysis marking the on-the-ground facts. Waiuru, for example, is a town based on largely defence personnel. It's a throughput, a main artery on State Highway 1. Average incomes, household incomes are quite high for a provincial location in New Zealand, and unemployment's really low. Kearney, similarly, not quite the same, but it's an international tourism destination with the Tongariro crossing, domestic and international around skiing as well, not as prolific as Queenstown and Wanaka, but they still get some international experience. But then just down the road, you've got Ratahi, and you've got places like Taumaranui where unemployment's really strong, deprivation levels are high, and again, that's being hidden by the fact that you've got other towns performing well. Another good example is Wellington, the Wellington region. Wellington City itself, highly affluent, lower levels of deprivation, but you see some pockets. But just down the road in Porirua, you have kids that haven't even been into Wellington City because they haven't been afforded the opportunity or can't afford the opportunity. And again, you see that in pockets of Lower Hutt and Upper Hutt. So things can change really quickly if you don't dive down into the detail, and that's why it's really important that you do.
One of the things that we're grappling with as an organisation at the moment is around the embedding of disruptive technologies. And whilst whether or not people were prepared for AI, we're certainly seeing a lot of upsurgence in what that looks like. We've had to reflect on what are the tasks that are dehumanised. And what are the ways that it can be embedded. Having a conversation, as I mentioned, with Gareth Hughes previously, one of the questions that we kind of posed was, if you go along and conduct analysis on a regular basis, through utilising technologies such as AI, we could actually potentially reduce the bias that's coming through in the analysis phase. And what's the human added value that you can then contribute to look at that and be able to move forward and say, hey, look, this is representative or not. What does that mean for data in the future? Sorry to put you on the spot, but really interested, because if we tease it out, the collation stage becomes something that can be automated, and some of that, the analytics can be, but it doesn't come in the terms of theming. I don't think that's something that can be done without a human eye over it, but interested in your thoughts around it.
Yeah, and look, I'm always in favour of embracing technology. I mean, when ChatGPT, for example, and it's the example often used by people now, although they might not have heard of it even as little as 5 or 6 months ago. It speeds things up. It makes things less complex. The data scientists here will speak much better to it because they're the ones that have been working in AI for many years. But it allows you to predict what's going to happen, because human behaviour can be remarkably consistent. We may all think that we're individuals and will act in random and completely spontaneous ways. Turns out not so much. And that trends just keep repeating themselves. When the economy tightens, and unemployment goes up, crime will increase. Regardless of where you are in the country, it'll happen. In Auckland, in Gisborne, Christchurch or Invercargill. Some of the good things about it means that we can begin to understand how people might act, and we can put in place interventions that might support them to enable better outcomes. Some of the other things that can take place is like work can certainly happen much faster. Analysis can occur more quickly. We can make that information more readily accessible. And you can begin to do things you otherwise wouldn't have been able to achieve. And it can change people's lives too. And it can certainly improve business process. And things, in terms of how things can be life-changing, getting access to credit in the United States of America is incredibly difficult, particularly if you don't have a credit record or if you come from a minority. If you're black, if you're Hispanic, if you've had other issues, it means you've had an inconsistent work history. And if you can't get credit in the States, it's really hard to access capital to buy a home, to get ahead in life. You've now got processes whereby they can collect a whole series of data points that can better inform that credit check away from just the FICO score. And that enables people to get access to capital, which means they can buy a home, which means they can have secure tenure, means they can raise a family, go to school, have consistency of education, and can have a better life journey. That's less of an issue here in New Zealand, but there'll be other ways that we can improve that here as well.
Are we starting to see any of this disruption in any of the data sets that you guys are starting to look at the moment?
Certainly around things like business performance, yes. I mean, I think for the last 3 or 4 years, New Zealand's been deemed by the World Bank to be the best place to open and run a business because we have been really good and demanding, but also delivering a digital public service. The Real Me process, the company's office registration, being able to file your GST return through Xero, directly uploading it and through to Inland Revenue. These are things that we begin to take for granted, and we always demand more, but we're just miles ahead of any other country. I think to the States, to the UK, to even technology giants like Japan or Korea, and even to Australia. We do a lot more. We embrace innovation, and our public services has delivered better outcomes, and that's been proven in these rankings that we see. So there's another example of AI and digital technology being used to improve people's lives and business operation.
When, as an organisation, you work for a lot of clients, you work for government, you work for local councils, you work for organisations, and sitting in this room, I couldn't help but be drawn to a couple of the posters on the wall here, one in particular around the utilisation and increase in EVs. From your perspective at the moment, what are some of the data trends that are coming through that you're seeing that you're going, actually, this is really going to impact on people's well-being as community members into the future?
Yeah, and some of those societal changes will have broad implications. And you mentioned one around EV usage, and I'd open that up and to say it's the way we consider energy. So we're seeing dramatic change in New Zealand. It's having implications already. I mentioned the Buller example. We're moving away from extractive resources, so fossil fuels, coal, oil, and into other more renewable, sustainable resources. And that has implications in Taranaki and South Taranaki and Stratford, where jobs will become less plentiful, incomes will reduce. It may create population distortion or dispersion, where people will move to new jobs. And those that remain may not feel as wealthy as they once were. That has implications for house prices. It makes rental accommodation more affordable, but it means your income may diminish. So as a percentage of your income, you might not even be better off. We're certainly seeing that on the west coast of the South Island, so Buller, Grey and Westland districts. We're seeing it in Clutha, Gore district, where there are large lignite deposits. You're seeing it in other parts of the rural South Island. So what would that mean for the future? Again, people will move around. We've seen it in the past. That's happened when we saw a restructure, for want of a better word, or certainly a rationalisation of freezing works around New Zealand. It comes about every time. It becomes a political hot potato with the mooting of the closure of the Tiwai smelter, because it's a large employer for the Southland district and for Invercargill. That would mean a distortion again of their local economy. You see it in the central North Island, and we have seen it historically around forestry and milling, when those local jobs and manufacturing were outsourced or exported to overseas. And that meant that places like Kawerau, Rotorua, Tokoroa, that have relied on that income and also that employment, that distorted their local economy. So these are the things that are changing.
Have you seen any changes as a result of the COVID environment? Like exports, for example, you've just touched on forestry. Huge exporter of forestry usually went over effectively as a raw product over to China. They would then send it back to us tannalised and we'd use it in business and construction. Have we seen a change in any of those dynamics and some of the stats that you're starting to see formulate, where people have gone, ooh, COVID happened, we weren't expecting it, but it's made us have to reevaluate what we're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a really good point, and it's a good question too, Steve. That's the other major change I'm seeing currently. So one around energy and extractive resources and how that's shaping New Zealand. And the other is around the implications of COVID and remote work. And also, coupled with remote work, a willingness of people to prioritise what they want to do, how they want to work, and how they want to live differently. They want a slower pace. They want to get out of the rat race. They now realise they can. And we're seeing that with a halo effect around major metropolitan areas, that all of a sudden people don't want to live in the middle of Wellington or in a suburban Wellington. They can have a more relaxed lifestyle, or they can afford to own a bigger home in a place like Carterton or South Wairarapa or Masterton. And Masterton actually is the area and the town that has shown the greatest improvement in deprivation levels over the last 8 years. And that's a flow-on effect of people moving out of Wellington and Masterton gentrifying. That's a really good story. It's not a perfect story, because it has an impact on locals with house prices going up and therefore rents going up, and if their incomes haven't gone up, it makes it a little bit harder. And you're seeing the same in Horowhenua and on the Kapiti coast, but you see it all around Auckland too. So Whangarei, Kaipara, Waikato district, and all the way down to Tauranga. And Tauranga will be another one of those areas that's gentrified and seen a vast improvement in deprivation over the last 8 to 9 years too. And I expect that'll continue now, because as Tauranga is gentrified, some people will get pushed out further. Where will they go? It's our own equivalent to the Gold Coast, really. It's almost down, it's gone to Papamoa and would ultimately go to Whakatane. In the last 6 months, so many of my colleagues and friends have moved more further flung locations. They've gone to Central Otago, to Cromwell, to Wanaka, because they can work there now and they can still live. Just yesterday we had an employee from here at Loves Data and one of our sister agencies who's just done exactly that just a month ago, moved to Wanaka, and his kids have been enrolled at school. Down there it keeps bumping into people from Wellington. There'll be a whole lot of Aucklanders down there too, because people are just saying, you know what, I can have a great life down here, I can enjoy the great outdoors, and I can still have good, gainful, professional employment that pays well. So it's a massive change. Fascinating. It'll be interesting to see how it unfolds.
Are you tracking what that looks like against productivity levels for New Zealand? I'm not sure if that's something that DOC goes along and is tracking alongside. Obviously, Treasury will be doing something, but is it having an impact on that productivity level? The hypothetical crystal ball gazer in me would probably suspect that initially there would have been a productivity drop. But now that people are able to work and play and live, increased fulfillment, increased productivity, is that coming through?
Not that we can yet see. It's difficult to measure and it'll take time to analyse. But I suspect, yes, what, in terms of productivity, what you're likely to see is more capital in those locations, and where you've got more capital will often, you'd hope, lead to enhancements in how people operate, be it business, public sector, or organisationally. Capital is often, can be a great lever. So that's one thing that we'll expect to see. In terms of other measures, productivity can also be considered not just through an economic lens, it can be considered through a social lens and a cultural lens and a family lens as well. I see benefits in my own life, hanging out with my kids, being there for them before or after school because I'm remote working. You can have an incredibly effective day without the distractions of those water cooler conversations. But you can also be there for your kids, and you can go to their sports games and coach their teams. And who knows, that will have flow-on effects. They feel better supported as a generation. That might have positive outcomes in terms of mental health and well-being, in terms of hospital or health admission rates, in terms of crime statistics. It'll be interesting to watch that over time. But generally speaking, I think with that refocus of prioritisation around what's important, it's not all about economic. It's not all about growth. It's also about what's good for people, what's good for me, what's good for my family.
If you think about the large data sets that we're collating as a nation, just reflecting on your comment there, what are some of those data sets that we should be looking at that says, hey, look, this is probably going to be a bit of a balancing act in terms of if we monitor these things, we may get a better picture of what is occurring from an equity and wellbeing perspective. So outside of the standard, here's our GDP, here's our standard economy, what are some of those data trends that we should be starting to have a look at?
Well, and the good story here is that Treasury is doing exactly that. It's not just about national, regional GDP, it's about the four capitals. Local government does it with the four wellbeings, and there needs to be a balance because there are constraints to growth. If we wanted to make more money, we'd go and live in a place where you can earn more money, but we choose to live on two volcanic islands in the middle of the Pacific because we've got a wonderful lifestyle in New Zealand. We can remove ourselves from some of the world's problems, and we can just enjoy living here and raising a family here and it being safe and there being strong communities and a strong sense of community. So those are some of the good things. Look, it's far from perfect. There's always things we need to work on, but making sure that we prioritise the economy, but also the environment, and also our social institutions and our families, and culturally, what's important as a country too. So those would be the four things that I'd focus on, and it's good that the Treasury is doing exactly that.
It's timely considering we've also included it in our dashboard, as you will know, with the Treasury's Living Standards framework, and watching the way that that's changing as well. It's not a static framework, which is really cool, where they are going, well, have we got this wellbeing framework correct, and going back out and re-engaging about that and tweaking things and going, actually there's more impetus and more importance on this particular one now, how do we expand that? So that's been cool to see. We've been able to today have a chat about the importance of the data and making sure that we can support our local communities through guiding with quality and informative, inbuilt with lived experience data. We've had a bit of a chat around disruptive technologies, which I'm sure is going to be coming through in the data in the future as to the overall impact of what that's going to occur. But at the end of each of these podcast sessions, we like to leave it with a bit of a personal note and have the opportunity for you to kind of talk to your own personal ethos around this, which is based on Tim Ferriss and his tribe of mentors. And one of the questions that he asked, which we tweak a little bit, is just around if you could go along and write something on a billboard that millions of people would see that could influence change, what would that be?
Probably something along the lines of things will change, and that's okay, because they are. And change is really hard for people. It's particularly hard for people when it directly impacts them. But look, I'm always learning from the generations that follow, and my kids laugh at me for some of my quirks from the way that I was brought up. And that must be magnified for those that have come before me as well. But things will change, and that will be okay. And yeah, that would be a message I'd get out there.
Awesome, fantastic. Thanks everybody for listening in today. We look forward to your participation in the next podcast, where we'll be sitting down with Marama Royal from Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei and having a conversation around community engagement and the importance of te ao Māori in that perspective. Kia ora.